Hello and welcome back, first grade. Today's story is called Liberty and Justice for All. Today's learning objectives are to describe the contributions of the Founding Fathers, describe the roles of enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and women during the evolution from colonies to independence, demonstrate an understanding of the word equally, and then use a graphic organizer to plan an informational paragraph. Our key vocabulary for today, we've got equally, justice, and liberty. Equally. Equally means in the same way or with the same amount. The parents treated their children equally, setting the same bedtime for all of them. My parents did that. We always had to go to bed at 8:30. Justice. Justice is fairness, especially in the way that people are treated. A judge's job is to make sure that all people in court receive justice or are treated fairly. Liberty. Liberty means freedom. Antonio's parents have given him the liberty to choose the type of shoes he would like to wear to school. Wow, Miss Bimmer had a hard time reading that one. So he got the freedom to choose what shoes he wanted to wear to school. And those are some pretty cool shoes. Do you remember what the names of the founding fathers we've learned about were? Do you remember their names? There were 3 that we really talked about, but then there was another one that we mentioned and talked a little bit about. We talked about George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and then the 4th one that we just kind of mentioned was John Adams. Okay? What have we been learning about? What has been the whole point of our unit? We've been learning about the colonies being separate or getting their freedom from Great Britain, right? We learned about how the colonies, they fought against Great Britain. They became their own independent country. But why did they do that? Why were they doing that? Why did they want to fight? Or why did they not want to be part of Great Britain anymore? Because the king was not treating them fairly, was he? Okay, so we're going to hear 2 words in our read aloud. Both of those words are in our key vocabulary, okay? Liberty and justice. Remember that liberty means freedom. And like I said earlier, the war against Great Britain was fought so that Americans could be free citizens, so that they could make their own laws, okay? Can you repeat after me? Liberty means freedom. Liberty means freedom. All right. And then justice. Remember, justice means treating others fairly. And that's partially why they fought the war, right? Because they wanted to make sure that the laws they had to follow were fair for everybody. Okay? Now I want you to say, justice means fairness. Justice means fairness. Okay? So today we're going to be learning about others who were living in America at the same time. We had enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and women. And I want you to think about, what do you think these groups of people might have been doing while others were fighting and planning their independence from Great Britain? So in all stories that we've read so far, where George Washington was leading the army, and where Thomas Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, where the Constitutional Convention happened. Okay, so I want you to think about all of those stories. What do you think that the women, the enslaved Africans, and the Native Americans were doing during those read-alouds? I want you to hold on to those thoughts, and I want you to see if you are correct. Remember our key vocabulary. We've got equally, justice, and liberty. All right, while I read, I want you to think about all 3 groups: enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and women. And I want you to decide whether these people were given liberty and justice, freedom, and fairness when the United States was a new country. Okay, I want you to think about that. Emmy always wants to play with her mouse toy when I'm recording my lessons. All right. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where have you heard those words before? I want you to listen again and see if you remember who wrote these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Do you remember who wrote those important words? Here's a hint. He was one of our founding fathers, and he was a wonderful writer. He lived at Monticello, and he became our third president. That's right, it was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote them as a part of our Declaration of Independence. Remember how the fathers felt that they were being treated unfairly by the British? Well, they did not feel that they were being treated equally or the same as the British on the other side of the ocean. Remember, because the colonists, they weren't allowed to have anybody represent them, and they didn't have any voice as to where their money was going, and they were getting taxed really high. Okay? The colonists wanted liberty or freedom from the rules of the British. And so, when Jefferson sat down to write these famous words, he wanted to make sure that the new American nation would treat its people fairly. Again, when the founding fathers met to write our Constitution of the United States, they wrote about liberty and justice. Remember that justice means fairness. So they were writing about freedom and fairness when they wrote about liberty and justice. When we hold our hands over our hearts and pledge the allegiance to our country, those final words are with liberty and justice for all. Okay? These are important words written by our founding fathers, but not all people were treated fairly in the American colonies, which is kind of sad, isn't it? Actually, it's very sad. Can you think of some people who might not have been treated fairly or equally? Let's see if you're right. Let's look back at the 1700s during and after the war when the founding fathers were busy writing these important words. Whom did they mean when they wrote in the Constitution, "We, the people of the United States"? Some people say they might have just been thinking about themselves, a group of white men who made the laws of the land. Were they forgetting the other people on the continent, Native Americans who had lived there for the longest, women, enslaved Africans? These were very smart men, writing words that they knew would be read and reread by others for many years to come. They were writing for the future. Nevertheless, it is true that not everyone in colonial times was treated equally. And even today, people are still seeking liberty and justice for all. During the Revolutionary War, women had different roles than they have today. Although today many women serve in our military and help protect us by fighting in wars, this wasn't the case during the Revolutionary War. Hey guys, did you know that we actually have a teacher at our school, and she is part of the Coast Guard, which is part of our military? How cool is that? Her name is Miss Palmer, and she is awesome. Okay. Some women wanted to be soldiers, but they weren't allowed to join the army. We know that some women actually disguised themselves by dressing like men so that they could fight alongside them. Okay? In this picture, I want you to look at this person right here. Okay? One of the most famous of these women was Deborah Sampson, who fought in the war under the name of Robert Shirtliff. Women were also not allowed to vote. And in fact, all women did not receive the right to vote in America for nearly 150 years after the Constitution was written. So women were not treated the same way that the men were treated. So remember that one reason that they fought the war was because the colonists felt that it was unfair that they could not vote in British Parliament. Yet women weren't allowed to vote in their own land. Do you think that that was fair? Do you think that that was liberty and justice for all? No, it was not. There were many people from Africa who were brought to America and enslaved by colonists. When the colonists decided to fight for their freedom again from Great Britain, they themselves were keeping freedom from a large number of Africans by enslaving them. These Africans did not have freedom to choose how to live their lives. Slavery was especially common in the South, where huge plantations had large amounts of land to farm, and colonists depended upon the work of enslaved Africans. So we kind of talked about this in our Black History Month unit, right? We talked about how people were not very nice to them. People were not very nice to African Americans. They treated them very poorly. Okay. Can you imagine how difficult it was to harvest or pick crops like the cotton shown in this image before there were machines to do it? Can you imagine how hard it would be to do that? In the New England and Middle States, slavery started to disappear after the Revolutionary War, but continued for a long time in the South, where these large farms were located. Enslaved Africans also were not allowed to vote. Was that liberty and justice for all? Absolutely not. For a long time, Native Americans lived on the North American continent alone. Yet life for them began to change when the first European explorers arrived hundreds of years before the Revolutionary War. You will remember that some of them chose to help the colonists and trade with them when they first arrived. However, it wasn't long before the colonists started exploring lands to the west, pushing the Native Americans off their land. Native Americans also were not allowed to vote. Was that liberty and justice for all? So what do you think? Was the decision of our nation's founders to fight a 6-year war for independence a wise decision? Do you think that it was a good decision for them to fight for freedom? It probably was. The government they set up 200 years ago has served as a model for the rest of the world ever since. It was certainly not fair to all people in the early years, and there are still in many ways in which it can be improved, but it is up to us, we the people, to make each day a better day for all of us. So it sounds like the founding fathers had the right idea. They did say that every single person was supposed to be treated fairly, right? And they were supposed to be able to live in the pursuit, or they were supposed to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So they had the right idea, but in the early years, those ideas weren't completely followed, right? Because the women were not allowed to, they were not treated fairly. The African Americans were not treated fairly. The Native Americans were not treated fairly, okay? And we have come a long way, and we've talked about this for Black History Month too. We've come a long way, but we still got a long way to go. And the best way that we can do our part is to make sure that we treat people fairly, no matter where they come from, or what language they speak, or what religion they practice, right? We are going to treat them all fairly because that is the right thing to do. Okay? Alrighty, comprehension questions and word work. Also, if you need to hop up and get a wiggle break in, go for it and then come back, okay? What were the big words that we were listening for in the read aloud today? Liberty and justice. Do you remember what those two words mean? They mean freedom and fairness. The Declaration of Independence of the new nation states that all men are created equal. What groups of people that you heard about were not given certain rights at the time that the Declaration was written? So who at first was not treated equally? The women, the African Americans, and the Native Americans. If a woman wanted to fight in a battle, what did she have to do? Back then, she had to dress up in a disguise. Okay. What were some of the ways that enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and women were not given liberty or justice? What were some of the ways that they were not treated with, they did not have freedom and fairness? The enslaved Africans didn't have any freedoms and they weren't allowed to vote. The Native Americans were pushed off their lands and they weren't allowed to vote. The women were not allowed to fight for their country and they weren't allowed to vote. Okay. So the title of today's Read Aloud is a question. It said, Liberty and Justice for All. Why do you think the author chose this title? Maybe because the author is trying to explain to us that even though in our Constitution and in our Declaration of Independence, we talk about having liberty and justice for everybody, but we don't always practice that. And so I think he or she is trying to bring our attention to that issue so that we can help be the solution, so that we can make sure that people get freedom and fairness. Okay? In the read aloud you heard, the founders did not feel that they were being treated equally or the same as the British on the other side of the ocean. Can you say the word equally for me? Equally. Can you clap it out? Equally. Okay. Equally means treating someone exactly the same as another, or dividing something into parts that are the same size or amount. I divided the pie equally among all the people at the table. I'm going to name two groups of people. If you think that they are treated equally or the same, say, I think they are treated equally. If you don't think that they are treated the same, I want you to say, I don't think that they are treated equally. Now, these answers are your opinion, okay? These are your opinion. So they could be different than mine, okay? Or they could be different than somebody else in your home or one of your other classmates, okay? And that's okay. This is your opinion. Do you think that parents and children are treated equally? I'd probably have to go with no most of the time, just because parents are able to do a lot of things. They are allowed to, most of them are allowed to vote. Children are not old enough yet, okay? There are other things too. Parents are able to drive. Children, depending on how old they are not, okay? Girls and boys. What do you think? I think that for the most part, they are now, but there are definitely still times where they are not treated equally. But I think that for the most part, they are. And that's in my opinion. And if you have a different opinion, that is okay. Students and teachers. I think my answer for this one is very similar to my answer for the parents and the children. What about brothers and sisters? I hope so. I hope that you're treated equally to your brother or your sister. Okay. All right, friends. Let's make sure that we have hit our learning objectives for today. Did we describe the contributions of the founding fathers? Mm-hmm. Did we talk about the roles of the enslaved Africans, the Native Americans, and the women during the evolution from colonies to independence? Yeah. Did we talk about the word equally? Mm-hmm. And in a minute, you're going to use a graphic organizer to plan an informational paragraph. All right, guys. See you next time.